It was on a breezy Thursday in early September that the St. Mary Mead Garden Club gathered for its monthly meeting. A gathering that, to the casual observer, was a pleasant tableau of geraniums, sponge cakes, and polite gossip. The venue, as always, was the rose-laden lawn of Mrs. Caroline Eversley's home, a grand Georgian residence with ivy-draped windows and the faint air of faded gentility. Tea was served from a silver service, and cucumber sandwiches were distributed by a brisk young maid whose accent betrayed a London upbringing, something which did not go unremarked by Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual wicker chair beneath the wisteria-covered pergola, knitting needles clicking gently in her lap. Her expression was vague, distant even, but her blue eyes, sharp as ever, took in everything. The subtle glances, the too hearty laughs, the way Mrs. Dalrymple refilled her own cup after barely touching the first. What should have been a typical village afternoon took a turn for the curious precisely at 3:47 p.m., when a loud crash came from the drawing room. The conversation halted. It was the sort of sound that suggested more than a dropped cup. It held finality. Mrs. Eversley, ever the hostess, turned pale and stood abruptly. "Excuse me, ladies," she said, smoothing her dress. That sounded rather like my Shelley tea set. As she hurried into the house, several ladies exchanged glances. Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple. "The Shelley? Isn't that the one with the bluebells?" "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple, threading her yarn with nimble fingers. "A wedding gift from Admiral Eversley's aunt. She prizes it terribly." Moments later, a shriek rang. Out, sharp, high, unmistakably frightened. This time, no one stayed seated. The entire garden club surged toward the house like hens startled from a roost. Miss Marple, moving with deliberate calm, followed behind them, her knitting tucked neatly into her handbag. The drawing room presented a scene of quiet chaos. A delicate porcelain teacup lay in fragments on the oriental rug. But it was not the shattered crockery that held everyone's attention. It was the still body of a man slumped in Mrs. Eversley's high-backed velvet armchair. The man, perhaps in his late 50s, wore a tweed suit of considerable expense and sported a burgundy cravat now askew around his neck. A faint trickle of blood darkened his temple, and his face was an unsettling shade of gray. Dr. Haydock was summoned, and Inspector Cray arrived shortly thereafter, an officious young man with polished boots and a clipped mustache that he believed lent him gravitas. He took control of the room, keeping the gathering guests outside and questioning each one briskly. "Name's Archibald Forsyth," he muttered as he examined the deceased's wallet. "From Bath, a solicitor." Miss Marple, watching from a nearby settee, gave a quiet, almost imperceptible nod. She remembered the man now. Archibald Forsyth had been introduced just the previous month at the vicarage, something to do with helping Mrs. Eversley update her will. There had been no reason to take special note of him at the time, but now, it seemed, he had returned unannounced and unwelcome. "A heart attack, perhaps?" offered Mrs. Bantry hopefully. Dr. Haydock grunted. "Possibly, but that cut on the head needs explaining. Could have fallen, of course, but not many people fall neatly into armchairs." Mrs. Eversley, white-faced and trembling, confirmed that she had not invited Mr. Forsyth to the gathering. "I hadn't seen him since last month," she said. "He was assisting me with some estate matters. I had no idea he was even in the village today." The silver tray on the sideboard held only 3 cups. One had been knocked to the floor. The other 2 sat untouched, one half filled with now lukewarm tea. Miss Marple stood beside the tray and looked at the ruined teacup. Its pieces were spread farther than one might expect from a simple drop. Some had skittered beneath the armchair, and there was a smear of liquid across the hearth tiles. "Curious," she said softly. "Something catch your attention, Miss Marple?" Inspector Cray asked with polite disinterest. "Oh no, not at all," she replied, smiling gently. Only, I believe Mrs. Eversley mentioned that her Shelley teacups were never used outside of special occasions. It seems odd that one would be out during an informal garden club afternoon. Cray blinked. Well, perhaps she made an exception. Perhaps, said Miss Marple, and went back to her seat. Outside, the garden was already abuzz. Theories spread like wind-blown seeds. Mrs. Bantry declared it poisoning. Mrs. Dalrymple was convinced it had something to do with unpaid debts. Reverend Clement wondered aloud if the solicitor had been blackmailing someone. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely watched the way Mrs. Eversley kept wringing her hands, the flicker of fear behind her eyes, the slight twitch when Forsyth's name was mentioned. She also noticed the maid, the London girl, standing a little too still behind the doorway, her eyes trained not on the body but on the tray. Yes, it was all quite odd. A shattered teacup, an unexpected visitor, and a drawing-room death without any sign of a struggle. Miss Marple, who had once identified a murderer based on how someone buttered a crumpet, thought she might already know which threads needed tugging. But she would wait. People revealed themselves in time, and there was no need to rush when human nature would do the unmasking for her. For now, she simply resumed her knitting. Mrs. Eversley sat stiffly on the floral settee, her back straight as a lamppost, hands tightly clasped, in her lap. Her teacup, one of the surviving Shelley pieces, sat untouched on the side table beside her. Dr. Haydock had seen to her once he'd finished with the unfortunate Mr. Forsyth, giving her a small tablet to calm her nerves. She had swallowed it, obediently, though her eyes remained glassy, like a woman watching her house burn down from the garden gate. Miss Marple, seated nearby, glanced once more at the broken teacup on the hearth. Someone had cleared the worst of the shards, but a few delicate fragments still glinted in the rug's pile, pale blue china with hand-painted bellflowers, now cruelly fractured. The inspector, notebook in hand, had begun questioning the guests individually in the dining room. The garden party had become an interrogation queue, with townsfolk drifting in and out of the room like hesitant actors awaiting their cues. Most of them were eager to speak, eager to contribute, to seem helpful, to reassure themselves that such a thing could not happen in St. Mary Mead without some exotic explanation. Miss Marple knew better. When it was Mrs. Bantry's turn, she swept past with a murmured, "Wish me luck," and then disappeared through the doorway, already rehearsing, her account aloud to herself. Miss Marple used the momentary lull to gently address the maid, the young woman with the Cockney accent, who had been lingering near the hall with downcast eyes. "You're Violet, aren't you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft and kindly, as if asking about the weather. The girl blinked, startled. Yes, miss." "You've not been here long, have you? I believe I saw you first just a fortnight ago." "That's right, miss. Started 2 weeks Tuesday." "And what do you think of our quiet little village so far?" Violet hesitated. "It's quieter than Kentish Town for sure. But it's not so quiet today, is it?" "No, not today," Miss Marple agreed, her voice touched with a sigh. "I expect Mr. Forsyth surprised you when he arrived?" "I didn't see him come in, miss. I was busy in the kitchen, clearing up the biscuit tins from the first tea tray. Mrs. Eversley told me not to bother with the drawing room, said she'd serve him herself if any guest went inside." "She did she?" Violet nodded, rubbing her hands nervously against her apron. "I didn't think nothing of it, but when I came back out, he was already— well, you saw him." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, the yarn in her bag. "Untouched. Strange, isn't it? How someone can come into a room so full of people and yet go unseen." Before Violet could answer, the inspector returned, pausing just behind Miss Marple. He wore an expression of determined skepticism. "I do appreciate you keeping everyone calm, Miss Marple," he said in a voice meant to sound courteous. "But I'll take it from here. Mind if I ask you a few questions next?" "Of course not," she said sweetly, and rose with the aid of her cane. He led her into the drawing room, now cleared save for the coroner's assistant, who was making notes beside the late Mr. Forsyth. Cray gestured to a chair near the fireplace. "Miss Marple, you've lived in St. Mary Mead longer than most. You know everyone's business, or so they say." "Oh, people do say such things," she smiled, "though it's usually only half true. I'll take the half that counts. Did you know Mr. Forsyth?" "We were introduced last month at the vicarage. A formal sort of man. Impeccable grooming. He wore Italian leather shoes, highly polished. Not the sort to show up uninvited?" "Oh, quite the opposite. Though some people develop unexpected habits later in life. Solicitors are very often discreet. Until they aren't." Cray scratched something into his notebook. "You noticed the teacup?" "Yes. I thought it curious. The Shelley china, as you may have heard, is reserved by Mrs. Eversley for very special occasions. It seemed odd she would use one in the drawing room when the rest of the guests were having tea outside. You think she made him a private cup? It would appear so. Though whether out of kindness or caution, I couldn't say." Cray gave her a narrow look. "You think he was poisoned?" Miss Marple gave the faintest shrug. "It would be too early to conclude. Still, death in a chair with a fresh cup nearby does rather suggest something ingested." "And the head wound?" "Ah, now that is a mystery. He could have stumbled, though he was already seated when he died. There's no sign of a fall. Perhaps someone tried to make it look accidental." Cray tapped his pencil against his teeth, frustrated. "The only fingerprints on the cup were Mrs. Eversley's, and we haven't found any signs of forced entry. Then perhaps we ought to look at what sort of entry was permitted." He blinked. "Meaning?" Miss Marple offered a slight enigmatic smile. "A man like Mr. Forsyth doesn't come unannounced unless he has something to bargain with. Or unless he believes he holds power over the person he's visiting." Cray frowned. "You think he was blackmailing Mrs. Eversley?" "I think he came expecting a private conversation. The teacup says as much." Miss Marple left the drawing room shortly thereafter, and it wasn't long before she found herself again among the murmuring villagers. Mrs. Bantry had already relayed her interview experience to 3 different people, each time embellishing slightly. "He looked positively lifeless, dear. Like he'd been dead hours, though of course it couldn't have been more than minutes." "The doctor said no such thing," murmured Miss Hartnell, sniffing. "He didn't have to. It was all over the man's face." Miss Marple took her usual spot beneath the pergola. A few minutes passed before Mrs. Eversley emerged, looking brittle but composed. She joined Miss Marple on the bench, brushing a speck of imaginary dust from her sleeve. "I suppose the rumors are already forming," she said flatly. "They are," Miss Marple replied. "You know how we villagers are. A death always brings out the theorists." Mrs. Eversley gave a strained smile. "I suppose they think I invited him in and poisoned his tea." "Well," Miss Marple said gently, "they may not say it aloud, but yes." Mrs. Eversley turned toward her. "I didn't invite him, Jane. I swear it. I hadn't heard from him since August, and I certainly wouldn't, well, do anything foolish." "I'm sure you wouldn't. But may I ask, did he threaten you?" Caroline flinched. "No, not in so many words. But he did know things about my late husband's estate, about some financial decisions I made after the funeral. He hinted there might be legal consequences." "I see," said Miss Marple, her voice unreadable. The older woman's voice dropped. "I was expecting him to return. I just didn't expect it today, or like this." Miss Marple looked out at the garden, where the roses nodded lazily in the breeze. "You gave him tea," she said. "I thought it would calm him down. We could talk, settle the matter quietly. He always liked Earl Grey. And yet you used the Shelley set." Caroline's eyes flickered. "I wanted him to know I was serious, that I was being gracious." Miss Marple nodded and said no more, but something had already settled in her mind. Not a solution, not quite, but the shape of something, a pattern forming in the background. The Shelley teacup had shattered. But the truth, Miss Marple knew, was still intact. It only needed to be poured out carefully. The day wore on with an uneasy calm settling over St. Mary Mead. News of Archibald Forsyth's death spread quickly through the village, carried in whispers, and hushed tones from the village post office to the grocer's shop, and, inevitably, the church pews. The usual hum of gossip grew thick with speculation, each version more dramatic than the last, but none quite satisfying in its simplicity. Miss Marple remained a quiet observer amidst the growing tumult, watching the subtle shifts in expressions and body language more keenly than any spoken word. She could sense the village was on edge, not simply because of the death, but because buried beneath the polite exteriors was a network of secrets waiting to be uncovered. That afternoon, after the visitors had dispersed, the local constable returned to Mrs. Eversley's house to conduct a more thorough search. Miss Marple accompanied him, not out of necessity but rather from habit. She liked to see with her own eyes what others overlooked. The drawing room, once lively with genteel chatter, was now heavy with a somber stillness. The furniture remained undisturbed save for the armchair where Forsyth had met his end and the small table with its scattering of porcelain fragments. On the mantelpiece, a photograph caught Miss Marple's eye, a sepia-toned image of a younger Caroline Eversley, radiant in her wedding gown, standing alongside a tall, dignified man in naval uniform. She recalled the mention of Admiral Eversley, the late husband whose estate had become the source of Forsyth's involvement. The portrait seemed to capture a happier time, a stark contrast to the tension lingering in the room. The constable began his search systematically, opening drawers and lifting cushions, though there was little hope of finding anything of immediate interest. Miss Marple's gaze, however, drifted to a small side table near the window where a lace handkerchief lay folded. It was embroidered delicately with the initials C.E., but on closer inspection, she noticed a faint, almost imperceptible stain near one corner, dark and slightly sticky. "Have you seen this before?" she asked the constable, holding the handkerchief up. He shrugged. "Looks like a bit of tea, perhaps, or old ink." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, this is something else." She smelled it subtly. "It's dried blood." The constable's eyes widened slightly. "Blood? On Mrs. Eversley's handkerchief?" "Could be important," Miss Marple said. And yet, no one mentioned it. The silence that followed was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, summoned back to clarify some details about the cause of death. He listened intently as Miss Marple described the handkerchief. "Blood stains on a handkerchief could indicate a struggle," the doctor mused. "Or it might be from the injury itself. Do you think the cut on Mr. Forsyth's head was inflicted by someone else?" Miss Marple asked gently. Dr. Haydock considered. "It's possible. The wound was fresh, but not deep enough alone to cause death. My opinion is the fatal event was sudden, likely cardiac arrest, but I cannot exclude the possibility that he was startled or frightened first." "Frightened enough to die?" Miss Marple prompted. "It can happen, especially in men of his age with underlying heart conditions." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind weaving through the fragments of evidence. "Thank you, Doctor." As the afternoon waned, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Inspector Cray, back from the police station with more inquiries. His expression was less polished than earlier, shadows beneath his eyes suggesting fatigue or perhaps frustration. "I've just spoken to Mr. Forsyth's secretary in Bath," he announced as he entered. "Apparently, there's been tension between Forsyth and several clients regarding financial discrepancies." He paused, studying the faces in the room, before continuing. "One client in particular, Mrs. Gladys Whittington, is said to have threatened legal action against him. He may have been involved in some dubious practices." "Did this Mrs. Whittington know Mr. Forsyth was here today?" Miss Marple asked. "No, we don't believe so. But it gives us a potential motive for someone to want him silenced." Mrs. Eversley, seated nearby, paled visibly. "I had no idea he was involved in anything illegal." Mrs. Whittington lives at the edge of the village, Cray added. I intend to pay her a visit shortly. Miss Marple looked toward Caroline, sensing the tension coiling beneath her calm exterior. Do you think you could speak with Mrs. Whittington before the inspector arrives? Sometimes a friendly word goes further than official questions. Caroline hesitated, but nodded. Yes, I will. Miss Marple took the moment to quietly observe the other guests, now gathered again in the garden. Mrs. Bantry was engaged in an animated discussion with the vicar, Reverend Clement, who seemed unusually guarded. Mr. Pritchard, the local bank manager, hovered near the edge of the group, his sharp eyes flicking toward the house. Even the maid Violet appeared unsettled, darting glances between the guests and the drawing room. It was then that Miss Marple noticed a small detail, a smudge of dirt on Violet's left cuff. Something not consistent with her duties in the kitchen. When Violet moved, she dropped a folded piece of paper near the back door, hastily retrieving it, but not before Miss Marple had caught sight of the faded handwriting. Later, after the guests had departed, Miss Marple sought out Violet. In the kitchen, the girl's hands trembled as she poured the evening tea, but when Miss Marple approached, she spoke with surprising steadiness. I saw Mr. Forsyth in the hall earlier, miss, Violet began. He seemed angry, kept muttering about money and threats. I overheard him saying, if you won't pay, then I'll see you suffer. I think he was talking to Mrs. Eversley. Miss Marple nodded, encouraging the girl to continue. But then, when he sat in the drawing room, I heard a noise, like a thud, and then he was on the floor. Did you see anyone else come in after him? No, miss. But I did see Mr. Pritchard near the back door earlier. He seemed in a hurry and his cuffs were dirty, like he'd been digging or kneeling outside. That's very interesting, Violet. Thank you for telling me. Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. Mr. Pritchard, the banker, was someone she had always considered respectable, but financial woes could unsettle even the most upright citizens. The presence of dirt on his cuff suggested something hidden in the garden or nearby. As dusk fell, Miss Marple retired to her small sitting room, pulling out her knitting but unable to focus. Her mind pieced together the day's revelations. A solicitor with shadowy dealings, a threatened client, a distressed hostess, a hurried banker, and a nervous maid. Each seemed to carry a fragment of the puzzle, but how they fit remained elusive. She recalled the shattered Shelley teacup once more, symbolic perhaps of fragile facades broken by harsh truths. Tomorrow she would pay a visit to Mrs. Whittington, and perhaps the murmurings of St. Mary Mead would reveal their secrets more fully. For now, the village was no longer the quiet place she had known. Beneath the surface, something dangerous lurked, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it, one subtle thread at a time. The morning sun crept softly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting a gentle glow over the neat rows of knitting needles and the well-worn armchair she occupied. Yet, despite the peaceful light, the threads of the mystery in St. Mary Mead wove ever tighter in her mind, tugging at her curiosity with an urgency she had learned to heed over the years. She began her day with a brief visit to the village post office, where she overheard the latest gossip like a steady drip of water-shaping stone. Mrs. Bantry, naturally, had already spun a tale of sinister plots involving secret meetings and hidden documents, while the vicar had quietly voiced concerns about the disruptive shadow Forsyth's death cast over their tranquil community. But Miss Marple's thoughts were not swayed by rumor. What she sought was truth beneath the noise, subtle patterns that only a keen observer could discern. Later, with a sturdy walking stick in hand and a discreet smile, she set out towards the modest cottage on the edge of the village where Mrs. Gladys Whittington resided. The narrow path wound past neat gardens and trimmed hedges, each home a vignette of village life untouched, or so it seemed. Mrs. Whittington answered the door promptly, a stout woman in her late 50s with a sharp gaze that held a flicker of unease. The greeting was cordial, but tinged with a certain wariness. Miss Marple, I presume? she said, stepping aside. "Come in, do come in. These are troubling times." Inside, the small parlor was cluttered with knitting baskets and half-finished quilts, evidence of a woman who kept busy but whose mind seemed heavy. "Mrs. Whittington," Miss Marple began gently, "I understand you had business with Mr. Forsyth." Mrs. Whittington sighed, settling into a creaking armchair. "Yes, though I'm not proud of it. I had reason to believe he was mishandling funds, mine included. I confronted him last month, threatened to take legal action. It was unpleasant." "Did he threaten you in return?" "No, not exactly," she replied, fingers tightening around her teacup. "But he did warn me that digging too deep might cause more harm than good. I thought he was bluffing." "Had you any idea he might come here today?" "No. I was surprised, frankly. I thought we'd resolved matters quietly. But I did hear he was at Mrs. Eversley's this afternoon." Miss Marple nodded. "Did you know Mrs. Eversley well?" "Not well, no. But we've crossed paths at village events. I can't imagine either of them wanting to come to blows, but Mr. Forsyth was a complicated man." They spoke at length, Mrs. Whittington revealing that Forsyth had a reputation for making enemies among his clients, but also that he carried secrets which made him dangerous. After her visit, Miss Marple took a leisurely walk back towards the village center, her mind alive with possibilities. She paused near the garden of the Eversley estate, glancing once more at the broken pieces of the Shelley teacup she imagined scattered across the hearth. That delicate china seemed a metaphor for the fragile relationships around her. Returning home briefly, she found Violet, the maid, waiting by the door, fidgeting with a small bundle of papers. The girl's expression was troubled but determined. "Miss Marple," Violet began, "I thought you might want to see these." Carefully, Miss Marple unfolded the papers. They were invoices and receipts from Forsyth's briefcase, detailing transactions, some legitimate and others suspicious. Among them was a letter, hastily written, hinting at an undisclosed meeting and a final demand for payment. No signature, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. Violet explained that she had found the papers behind a loose panel in the drawing room's bookcase while tidying earlier. Miss Marple studied the letter, noting the careful avoidance of names but the urgency within the lines. Someone wanted something and was willing to resort to threats to get it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Inspector Cray stepped inside, his expression sharper than before. "I've just spoken to Mrs. Eversley again," he reported. "She insists the only person who could have harmed Mr. Forsyth is someone with access to the house. No signs of forced entry mean it had to be someone he knew, or someone let in willingly." Miss Marple nodded. "That matches what I suspected, but it also means we must look closer at the household." Cray frowned. "You mean Violet?" "Among others," Miss Marple said carefully. "It's too early to say who is innocent or guilty. But I believe the answers lie within these walls, and the secrets they keep." She led the inspector to the drawing room once more, pointing to the lace handkerchief with the bloodstain. "Did you have that analyzed?" she asked. "We did," Cray replied. "It matches Mr. Forsyth's blood type. Then the question is, why was it in Mrs. Eversley's handkerchief? Was there a struggle, or was it placed there to mislead?" The inspector rubbed his chin. "If someone wanted to frame her, they had time before anyone entered the room." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Or perhaps they believed she was too fragile to be suspected." Cray shook his head, pacing. "I can't help but wonder about Mr. Pritchard. The banker seemed oddly evasive this morning. I think we need to question him again." Miss Marple agreed and resolved to observe the banker herself in the coming days. That evening, as the village settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resting forgotten in her lap. Her thoughts circled around the tangled web. Forsyth's threats, Mrs. Eversley's worry, Mrs. Whittington's anger, Violet's secret discoveries, and the elusive banker's furtive movements. In the shadows of St. Mary Mead, the truth lay hidden, broken, like the shards of a teacup, waiting for a steady hand to piece it all back together. The dawn rose quietly over St. Mary Mead, the soft light filtering through the trees and casting long shadows on the village streets. Miss Marple's day began with a brisk walk through the dew-laden gardens of her cottage, her mind already turning over the events of the past days. The pieces of the puzzle were gradually falling into place, but the picture remained incomplete and frustratingly elusive. She decided to pay a visit to Mr. Pritchard, the village's bank manager. The man had been acting peculiarly since the murder, his polite demeanor tinged with an undercurrent of nervous energy. Miss Marple had an instinct that the banker's outward calm masked something deeper, and perhaps darker. The bank was a modest building at the heart of the village, its polished windows gleaming in the morning sun. Miss Marple entered quietly, nodding to the clerk before making her way to the manager's office. The door was ajar, and she could hear Mr. Pritchard's low voice. He was on the telephone. "Yes, I understand, but it must be handled delicately. No one outside should know about this yet." He paused, then added with a sharper tone, "I will ensure the funds are available. No mistakes this time." Miss Marple waited patiently until he ended the call, then cleared her throat softly. "Good morning, Mr. Pritchard," she said. "May I have a moment?" Startled, he turned swiftly, forcing a polite smile. "Miss Marple, of course, please come in." She took a seat across from him. "I was hoping to ask a few questions about Mr. Forsyth's recent financial affairs. I hear there were some irregularities?" He adjusted his tie, eyes flickering with unease. "Irregularities is a strong word. Mr. Forsyth had certain difficulties, yes, but nothing out of the ordinary for someone managing multiple estates and clients." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And what of Mrs. Whittington's claims of misappropriation?" He gave a tight smile. "She's an upset client, nothing more. Emotions run high when money is involved. I assure you the bank was not involved in any wrongdoing." "But you were seen near Mrs. Eversley's garden shortly after the murder?" Miss Marple asked gently, watching his reaction. His jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. "I was taking a walk, nothing more. Yet your cuffs were soiled, as if you had been digging or kneeling. Would you explain that?" Mr. Pritchard's eyes darkened. "I found a broken flower pot in the garden. Someone had been careless. I tried to tidy it up." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you for your honesty. One last question. Have you noticed anything unusual from Violet the maid?" He hesitated. "Violet? No. Why do you ask?" "I have reason to believe she knows more than she lets on," Miss Marple said softly. Pritchard's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing further. Leaving the bank, Miss Marple felt the weight of unspoken tensions thickening in the village air. The pieces of Forsyth's financial dealings, the broken teacup, the maid's secretive behavior, and now Pritchard's evasions were all threads that needed careful weaving. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Violet herself. The girl greeted her with a mix of relief and apprehension, as if she had been waiting for a chance to unburden herself. "Miss Marple," Violet began, her voice low. "There's something I haven't told anyone." Miss Marple settled into a chair, inviting her gently. "You may speak freely, dear." Violet glanced around nervously before continuing. "I saw Mr. Forsyth arguing with someone in the garden just before he came inside. I didn't recognize the person. They wore a hat low over their face." Miss Marple's eyes lit with interest. "Did you see where this person went?" "No." They left quickly, disappearing down the lane toward the village. "And the argument? Was it heated?" "Yes." Forsyth seemed frightened afterward. Miss Marple made a note in her mind. The mysterious visitor added a new layer to the mystery. If Forsyth had enemies beyond the household, the net of suspicion widened. Later, as Miss Marple wandered through the village, she chanced upon Mrs. Bantry and the Reverend Clement in earnest conversation near the churchyard. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple greeted, joining them. "I hear the village is still abuzz with theories about Mr. Forsyth's death." Mrs. Bantry nodded emphatically. "Oh, yes, and the vicar has some rather strong opinions on the matter." The Reverend smiled thinly. "I only wish to remind everyone of the need for patience and proper inquiry. Jumping to conclusions serves no one." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, though she sensed a subtle tension between the two. Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "I can't help but feel there's more to this story than anyone dares say aloud. Secrets from the past have a way of surfacing when least expected." Miss Marple nodded, aware that beneath the village's polite surface lay deep currents of old grievances and concealed truths. That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple reviewed the notes she had gathered. The threatening letter found by Violet, Pritchard's questionable behavior, the unknown visitor in the garden, and the strained relationships among the village's key players. Her thoughts settled on the shattered teacup again, a symbol not just of broken china, but of fractured trust and hidden resentments. The solution would not be found in loud accusations or forensic evidence, but in understanding the subtle interactions, the silent glances, and the buried emotions of those involved. Tomorrow would bring further questions, and perhaps, at last, a glimpse of the truth lurking beneath St. Mary Mead's tranquil facade. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a slight breeze rustling the leaves outside Miss Marple's window. The village of St. Mary Mead was already stirring, its familiar rhythms pushing forward despite the shadow that hung over it. Miss Marple, however, was not content to let the days pass with idle speculation. There were still pieces missing, subtle gestures, whispered suspicions, and hidden truths, all of which demanded her attention. Her first call was to Mrs. Eversley's cottage. The elderly lady had been a central figure since the tragedy, and though her outward composure seemed steady, Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of worry beneath the surface. The small front garden was blooming with early spring flowers, their bright colors belying the tension that gathered within the walls. Mrs. Eversley welcomed her with a delicate smile, but pale cheeks. "Miss Marple, I'm glad you've come. It is so unsettling, this whole business." "I can imagine, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "May I ask you some more questions about the day of Mr. Forsyth's death?" "Of course. Anything to help." "Did you notice anyone unusual around the house before or after the incident? Anyone you might not have expected?" Mrs. Eversley hesitated, fidgeting with her lace handkerchief. "Well, now that you mention it, there was a man I didn't recognize, tall, wearing a dark coat and hat, who lingered near the gate. I thought him a stranger passing through, but he seemed to watch the house quite intently." "Could you describe him more?" "No, I'm afraid not." His face was mostly hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "I only caught the briefest glimpse before he turned and left toward the village." Miss Marple made a mental note. A mysterious stranger in the village was a thread they had not yet pulled fully. Did Mr. Forsyth seem troubled that day? "Any visitors or phone calls you are aware of?" Mrs. Eversley nodded slowly. "He was tense. He mentioned a final meeting that afternoon but refused to say with whom. He was rather secretive, which was unlike him." "And the teacup," Miss Marple began, then stopped herself, sensing Mrs. Eversley's discomfort. "It was my favorite," the older woman said, her voice cracking slightly. "I can't imagine how it came to be shattered. I fear the culprit meant to frighten me, or perhaps to send a message." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Sometimes a broken thing can reveal more than a whole one." As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Eversley asked quietly, "Do you believe someone here could have wanted him dead?" Miss Marple smiled gently but said nothing. In St. Mary Mead, motives were rarely straightforward, often tangled with years of unspoken grievances. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the local pub, the Crooked Horn, where villagers gathered in varying moods of curiosity, fear, and speculation. The pub was a hub for whispers, and today it buzzed with conversations about the unfolding investigation. She found Reverend Clement speaking quietly with several parishioners. Approaching them, she overheard fragments of their talk. Forsyth was no friend to many shady dealings, arguments, and now this tragedy. Miss Marple joined in, politely steering the conversation. "And what of Mrs. Whittington? Has anyone spoken to her since the incident?" A middle-aged man, Mr. Hargrove, spoke up. "She's been quite vocal, claiming Forsyth cheated her out of money. Some say she had every reason to want him gone." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Yet she was at the village post office early that morning, and several people saw her afterward." "Alibis can be convenient," muttered another voice. The discussion turned heated briefly, before Miss Marple gently changed the subject. She made a point to observe the faces around her, who looked anxious, who avoided eye contact, and who spoke too eagerly to convince. On her way out, she spotted Violet quietly wiping a table. The young maid's eyes flickered nervously as Miss Marple approached. "Violet, how are you holding up?" she asked softly. Violet hesitated, then nodded. "I'm managing. Thank you, Miss Marple." "You mentioned you saw someone arguing with Mr. Forsyth. Has anything else come to mind since?" Violet bit her lip. I remembered something else. When I found the papers behind the bookcase, there was also a small folded note hidden inside one of the files. "May I see it?" She shook her head. "I was afraid to keep it, so I gave it to the police, but I think it's important." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "What did it say?" Violet swallowed. "Just a few words, written hurriedly. Meet me at the old mill at midnight. Don't tell anyone." "The old mill," Miss Marple murmured. "That place has long been abandoned, but it was once a meeting spot for the villagers decades ago." The note added a new dimension to the mystery. A secret meeting place, an unknown correspondent, and a midnight appointment that might have sealed Mr. Forsyth's fate. That evening, Miss Marple took a solitary walk toward the outskirts of the village, where the ruins of the old mill stood silhouetted against the setting sun. The structure was a crumbling skeleton of stone and wood, overgrown with ivy and shrouded in shadows. She approached cautiously, noting the footprints in the soft earth near the entrance, recent but not fresh. Someone had been here after dark. Her keen eyes caught a scrap of cloth caught on a jagged stone. A fragment of fabric dyed a peculiar shade of blue, different from anything she had seen in the village so far. A detail, small but telling. "Miss." Marple turned slowly, the chill evening air biting at her cheeks. The mill held secrets, as did the people connected to it. She felt the threads tugging tighter, the pattern becoming clearer, but still incomplete. Returning to the village, she resolved to speak again with Inspector Cray, to share what she had learned and to encourage a thorough search of the old mill and the surrounding area. In the quiet of her sitting room that night, as the fire flickered low and the village slept under a blanket of stars, Miss Marple pondered the tangled web of hidden meetings, secret notes, and shadowy figures. Each revelation chipped away at the calm surface of St. Mary Mead, revealing the deep fractures beneath. The shattered teacup, once merely a broken object, had become a symbol of the village's fragile peace, soon to be broken forever unless Miss Marple could unravel the puzzle before the shadows grew too long. The following morning dawned with a mist hanging low over the fields surrounding St. Mary Mead, lending a muted softness to the village's familiar contours. Miss Marple, after a modest breakfast, set out toward the police station, intent on sharing her discoveries with Inspector Cray. The urgency she felt was tempered by her usual quiet resolve. She knew that patience, as much as insight, was essential in unraveling the truth. At the station, Cray greeted her with a curt nod. His office was cluttered with papers and evidence bags, the tangible signs of a case in progress. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hear you've uncovered something." "At the old mill." She nodded, handing him a small bundle of notes, including the details Violet had provided about the secret meeting and the scrap of blue fabric she had found caught on a stone. "The mill is more than just an abandoned building. Someone has been there recently, and I suspect it was connected to Mr. Forsyth's final hours." Inspector Cray frowned, running his fingers through his thinning hair. "We did send a couple of men to search the place last night, but found nothing except a few discarded bottles and some animal tracks." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet confidence. "Sometimes, Inspector, the most telling evidence is not what's found, but what is missing. And the footprints near the entrance suggest a visitor. Has anyone checked for the presence of the blue fabric in the village?" Cray hesitated. "Not specifically, no. We've been focused on the obvious suspects." "Perhaps a more thorough search is in order," Miss Marple suggested. "And I think we need to speak again with Mrs. Whittington. Her grievances with Mr. Forsyth might be more complex than mere money." Cray gave a non-committal grunt, but agreed to arrange an interview. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the village with a sense of purpose. She decided first to visit Mrs. Whittington at her modest cottage, tucked away in a quiet corner, near the churchyard. The woman was visibly agitated when Miss Marple arrived, wringing her hands as she sat near the window. "Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, "I know what they say, but I swear I had nothing to do with George's death." "I do not doubt your innocence, Mrs. Whittington," Miss Marple replied gently. "But I believe there is more to your story. Might you tell me about your relationship with Mr. Forsyth? How did things come to be so strained?" Mrs. Whittington's eyes welled with tears. "He promised to help with my late husband's debts, but instead he took advantage of me. I confronted him several times, but he just brushed me off, said it was all business." "Did you ever threaten him?" She shook her head vigorously. "No, never. I only wanted what was rightfully mine." Miss Marple pressed on. "Have you noticed anything unusual in the days before his death? Visitors, strange messages, anything out of the ordinary?" Mrs. Whittington hesitated, then whispered, "There was a man who came looking for George, a stranger in a dark coat. He asked questions, left no name. I heard them argue once, but I didn't get close enough to hear what was said." Miss Marple's mind raced. The mysterious visitor seen by both Mrs. Eversley and Mrs. Whittington was a common thread no one had yet fully explored. "Thank you, Mrs. Whittington. You've been very helpful." As Miss Marple left, she glanced at the overcast sky and decided to visit the old mill herself once more. She was drawn to its quiet menace and the possibility it held answers. The path to the mill was muddy from recent rain, and the scent of damp earth and wildflowers mingled in the air. Approaching the entrance, Miss Marple spotted fresh footprints, smaller this time, perhaps belonging to a woman. She followed them cautiously into the shadowy interior. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, the wooden beams creaking, faintly. Sunlight filtered through broken panes, casting fragmented light on the stone floor. Amid the rubble, Miss Marple noticed something, a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. She carefully unwrapped it to find a folded letter, yellowed and worn but legible. The letter was addressed to Mr. Forsyth and bore the unmistakable handwriting of someone close to the village. "My dear George," it read, "we must meet at the mill at midnight as planned. There is much to discuss, and I fear time is short. Trust no one but me. Your friend, A." The signature puzzled Miss Marple. Who could A be? She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Outside, the village seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the people she had met: the banker, the maid, the scorned client, the watchful neighbors, and to the subtle patterns in their words and actions. She resolved to speak with Mr. Pritchard, Again. If he was hiding something, the letter might be the key. Arriving at the bank late afternoon, she found Mr. Pritchard alone, going over ledgers with furrowed brow. "Mr. Pritchard," she began softly, "I have come across a letter that might be of interest. It suggests a secret meeting at the old mill involving Mr. Forsyth and someone identified only as A. Do you recognize this?" She handed him a copy. Pritchard's eyes narrowed as he scanned the text. "I have not seen this before," he said carefully, "but it does sound familiar. There was a man named Alfred who worked in the village years ago, a friend of Forsyth's family. Could A be Alfred? Miss Marple considered. It is possible, but Alfred left the village long ago. Might there be another? Pritchard shook his head. None come to mind. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Secrets can linger for a long time, Mr. Pritchard. Sometimes people hold on to them more tightly than they realize. She left the bank, her mind turning over the mystery once more. The letter, the mysterious visitor, the hidden meetings, each was a thread in the tapestry she was weaving. As dusk settled, Miss Marple returned home. The village was quiet now, but the undercurrents of fear and suspicion pulsed just beneath the surface. In the solitude of her sitting room, she thought about the people she had met, the clues uncovered, and the shadows that still concealed the truth. The shattered teacup was no longer merely a broken relic. It was a symbol of fractured trust and concealed motives. And Miss Marple, with her patient eyes and quiet wisdom, was determined to bring the truth into the light before the village's fragile peace shattered beyond repair. The village woke slowly beneath a veil of gentle rain, the kind that softened the colors of rooftops and left a delicate sheen upon the cobblestones. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a steaming cup of tea, allowed her mind to wander over the tangled web of clues and confidences she had gathered so far. The letter, signed simply A, was a puzzle piece that refused to fit neatly into place, but the insistence of its presence at the old mill spoke volumes. There was someone intent on secrecy, and the message had brought Mr. Forsyth to a place steeped in faded memories and shadows. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. It was Violet, the maid from the village pub, looking hesitant yet determined. "Miss Marple, may I come in? I thought you should know something." Miss Marple motioned her inside with a gentle smile. "Of course, Violet. What is it that's troubling you?" The girl glanced nervously toward the window, then lowered her voice. "It's about Mr. Forsyth and that secret meeting. I overheard something at the pub last night. 2 men were talking quietly in the corner. I didn't recognize one of them, but the other was Mr. Hargrove." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what did you hear?" Violet swallowed. "They mentioned a man called Adrian. One said he was back in the village after many years. They spoke about paying off debts and settling old scores." "Adrian?" Miss Marple murmured. The name struck a chord. It could well explain the initial A on the letter. "Do you think Adrian could be the A in the letter?" Violet asked. "It seems quite likely," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "Thank you for telling me, Violet. You've been very brave." After Violet left, Miss Marple pulled on her coat and set off toward the village green. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, and the air was fragrant with wet earth and budding leaves. She was determined to find out more about this Adrian. At the village post office, she found Mr. Hargrove leaning against the counter, speaking with the postmistress. When he spotted Miss Marple, he straightened and offered a wary nod. "Mr. Hargrove," Miss Marple began, "I understand you mentioned someone named Adrian at the pub last night. Would you mind clarifying who he is?" Hargrove's face tightened, but he did not retreat. "Adrian Smythe. He was a local once, left 20 years, ago under a cloud. Came back only recently, but not many people have seen him. Do you know the nature of the trouble he left behind?" "Mostly debts and some heated disputes. There was talk of fraud and betrayal. Not the kind of man you want stirring old memories. Miss Marple nodded, piecing together the fragments. And Mr. Forsyth, what was his relationship with Adrian? That's the mystery, Hargrove said. They were childhood friends, or so the story goes. But things went sour long ago. Forsyth kept his distance once Adrian left. I see. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Hargrove, who avoided her eyes. If Adrian has returned, it could explain the secret meeting and the letter. She thanked him and left, the rain now easing into a mist. Miss Marple next sought out Mrs. Eversley, whose cottage she had visited days before. The elderly woman was outside tending her garden and looked up in surprise. Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise, she said, though her smile did not reach her eyes. I wonder if you might recall anything more about Mr. Forsyth's acquaintances, particularly a man named Adrian Smythe. Mrs. Eversley's expression clouded. Adrian Smythe. Yes, I remember him. There was a scandal years ago involving him and the Forsyth family. It brought much shame. What kind of scandal? Mrs. Eversley glanced around cautiously before leaning in. Adrian was accused of embezzling funds from the village charity, but there were whispers he was set up. His disappearance left a stain on many reputations. Do you know where he might be now? Rumor has it he bought the old mill when it fell into disrepair. No one has seen him much, but he's said to be trying to clear his name quietly. Miss Marple thanked her and walked away, the pieces falling into place more distinctly now. Adrian Smythe's return to the village, the secret meeting at the mill, the old debts and broken trust. These were threads woven deep into the mystery. That evening, Miss Marple decided to visit the mill once more, this time with the intention of confronting its owner, if indeed Adrian Smythe was living there. The road was slippery from the earlier rain, and the dusk deepened into a blue-gray twilight as she approached the crumbling building. A figure stood near the entrance, silhouetted against the fading light. As she drew closer, the man turned, revealing sharp eyes and a wary expression. Miss Marple, he said with a dry smile. I've heard you've been asking questions. Mr. Smythe, I presume, she said calmly. He nodded. That would be me. I suppose you've come to hear my side of the story. Miss Marple stepped forward, her eyes steady. Yes, Adrian. I believe there are many sides to this tale, and I hope we can speak openly. For a moment, they regarded each other silently, the past heavy between them. I did know George Forsyth, Adrian began. We were friends once, but life changed things. I never wished him harm. If anything, I wanted to make amends. Yet, you arranged the secret meeting. Why? Adrian's jaw tightened. There were matters that could not be discussed openly, old debts, old betrayals. I hoped to find some resolution. Did the meeting happen? No. I waited, but George never came. I feared something was wrong, which is why I've stayed close since. Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly. Then you too are a victim of circumstance, Adrian, he sighed. I suppose so, but some here still think me a villain. I want to clear my name. Perhaps truth will do that, Miss Marple said quietly. As she left the mill, the air was cooler, the shadows deeper. The encounter had clarified much, but also raised new questions. Why had Forsyth not come to the meeting? Who had shattered the fragile peace of the village with violence? Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The village was a stage for old grudges and new fears, for hidden alliances and fractured loyalties. Yet, beneath it all, she sensed a fragile hope that understanding might emerge from the tangled past, and that justice, patient as always, would find its way. Outside, the rain began again, soft and steady, washing the village in quiet contemplation, as the mystery edged closer to its final unveiling. The rain persisted into the early morning hours, softening into a gentle patter that blended with the occasional hoot of an owl. Miss Marple sat by the window in her sitting room, the delicate steam of her now cooling tea rising in lazy spirals. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead lay draped in a misty shroud, as if holding its breath in anticipation. She pondered over the new pieces that had entered the puzzle. Adrian Smythe's hesitant confession, the secret meeting that never was, and the pervasive veil of old grudges that seemed to hang over every household. Yet, there remained an unsettling silence about George Forsyth's final moments. Why had he not come to the mill? What had diverted him or prevented his arrival? And what of the shattered teacup, a seemingly trivial object whose significance had thus far escaped scrutiny? Later that morning, Miss Marple made her way to the village pub, where a small gathering had already begun to stir. The patrons' faces reflected a mix of suspicion, relief, and lingering anxiety as news traveled fast in places so close-knit. She was greeted with cautious nods but no warmth, for many still viewed her involvement with skepticism, and others feared the unearthing of secrets better left buried. She found Constable Peters nursing a cup of tea behind the bar. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his tone more cordial than she had expected. "We've had a quiet night, though I must say, the village feels on edge." "Understandable," Miss Marple replied. "May I ask, have there been any new developments?" The constable sighed. "Well, nothing concrete, but I've been looking into Forsyth's movements before his death. Seems he visited several houses that evening, though no one recalls seeing him near the mill. Odd, isn't it?" "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her mind already weaving the threads. "Might I trouble you for a list of those houses? It could be helpful." "Of course." Peters handed her a small notebook. "If you want, you could visit some of them yourself. People tend to talk more freely to you than they do to me." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you, Constable. I'll see what I can uncover." Her first stop was the home of Mrs. Agatha Bellamy, a widow known for her sharp tongue and fondness for gossip. The garden was trimmed neatly, with bursts of color from primroses and daffodils. Mrs. Bellamy greeted Miss Marple at the door, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe this pleasure?" "I understand Mr. Forsyth called upon you the evening he died. Might I ask about the nature of your conversation?" Mrs. Bellamy shuffled inside and offered her a seat by the fire. George was always a polite man, but that night he seemed troubled. He spoke of debts he could not repay, said he feared consequences, though he wouldn't say from whom. Miss Marple nodded. "Did he mention anyone in particular?" Mrs. Bellamy hesitated. "There was an implication, a man from long ago, something about a past grievance." This aligned with what Miss Marple had learned about Adrian Smythe. "Thanks, you, Mrs. Bellamy. And did Mr. Forsyth leave abruptly?" "Yes, rather suddenly. He looked as if he had changed his mind about something, but he didn't explain why." From there, Miss Marple continued her inquiries, moving quietly through the village, listening more than speaking. At the Smithson farm, the family matriarch revealed that Forsyth had asked about a ledger, an old book said to contain accounts of village charity funds. No one knew where it was now, but the mention of it had caused a ripple of unease. At the village school, the headmistress recalled a heated discussion between Forsyth and the school's treasurer a week prior concerning missing money. The treasurer was an unassuming man named Harold Griggs, respected but easily rattled. By midday, Miss Marple's mind swirled with fresh information, yet a nagging thought persisted. What had Forsyth intended to do with these revelations? What danger had he feared so much? As the afternoon shadows lengthened, a sudden knock at the door startled her. It was Harold Griggs himself, looking pale and drawn. "Miss Marple," he began, voice trembling. "I need to speak with you," she invited him in, noting his agitation. "What troubles you, Mr. Griggs?" He swallowed hard, then confessed. "I'm afraid George Forsyth discovered something. something that implicated me. He confronted me about discrepancies in the charity accounts. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I only wanted to cover a shortfall, hoping to make it right before anyone noticed. Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but firm. Did you harm Mr. Forsyth? No, I couldn't. I was scared but not capable of such a thing. Then tell me about the night of his death. Harold nodded quickly. After our argument, I saw him leave the pub alone. Later, I heard about the meeting at the mill, but I don't believe George went there. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Did anyone else know about that meeting? Only George and Adrian Smythe. At least that's what I thought. Her thoughts shifted again to the mill and the absence of Forsyth that night. If he never reached the meeting, what had stopped? Him? And who had the opportunity to intercept him? That evening, Miss Marple returned to the inn, where the village was gathering once more. The atmosphere was thick with whispered theories and half-truths. Mrs. Bellamy, spotting her, beckoned over. You're stirring up quite the storm, Miss Marple. People are talking about secrets best left buried. I believe the truth will calm those storms, Miss Marple said softly. Her eyes scanned the crowd and settled on a figure standing apart. Violet, the maid from the pub, clutching a bundle of letters. Approaching her, Miss Marple asked, May I see those? Violet hesitated, then nodded, handing over a small stack of weathered envelopes, each addressed to George Forsyth. Unsigned, but all containing careful, guarded pleas for help or silence. Miss Marple's fingers brushed over the paper, and a pattern emerged. Threats, blackmail, entreaties to keep old secrets hidden. The village's serene facade was cracked, revealing a network of fear and deception. Turning to Violet, she asked gently, Where did you find these? In the mill, Violet whispered. I was cleaning up and found them tucked away in a loose floorboard. The discovery added a new layer to the mystery. If someone had been blackmailing Forsyth, it would explain the desperation in his last days and his secretive behavior. Miss Marple's gaze lifted, steady and knowing. We are closer now, Violet. Closer than ever. As the evening deepened, the rain resumed, tapping a steady rhythm against the windows, mirroring the quiet urgency in Miss Marple's heart. The village's secrets were unraveling, but the true story, painful, tangled, human, was only just beginning to reveal itself. The morning light filtered through the curtains with a muted glow, casting soft shadows across Miss Marple's sitting room. She sat by the small table, the stack of letters carefully arranged before her. Each one carried a weight of quiet menace, a silent testimony to the undercurrents roiling beneath the village's placid surface. Miss Marple's fingers traced, the delicate handwriting, her mind piecing together the voices behind the ink, voices of fear, betrayal, and desperate entreaties. The discovery of the letters in the mill had shifted the course of her thoughts profoundly. The mill, once a simple backdrop of village industry, now seemed a repository of secrets, a silent witness to the unfolding tragedy. But what had driven someone to hide these notes so carefully? And what did they hope to achieve by keeping Forsyth silent? Her reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, summoned at her request after the latest revelations. He entered briskly, carrying his usual air of determined purpose, his face betraying both weariness and curiosity. Good morning, Miss Marple, he said, nodding as he took a seat. You've been busy, I see. Indeed, Inspector. These letters found in the mill have given us much to consider. They speak of blackmail and concealed threats, more than anyone had anticipated. Craddock ran a hand through his thinning hair. Blackmail, you say? That certainly complicates things. Do you have an idea of who might be behind it? Not yet, but the letters suggest a network of grievances reaching far back. And the fact they were hidden in the mill is no coincidence. Whoever placed them there wanted them out of sight, yet close enough to torment Mr. Forsyth. The inspector's eyes narrowed. It raises a troubling question. If someone knew of the letters and their contents, why didn't they come forward sooner? Or worse, did someone take drastic measures to keep Forsyth silent? Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Precisely the questions we must answer. They agreed to revisit the mill together that afternoon, hoping the physical space might yield clues beyond the written word. Before parting, Inspector Craddock informed her of an unexpected visitor, a Mr. Jonathan Cleary, a solicitor from London, who had arrived to claim some papers related to Forsyth's estate. The mention of a solicitor hinted at another layer to the mystery. Why would someone from the city be involved in this small village affair? By midday, Miss Marple found herself walking toward the mill, the ground still damp from the night's rain. The mill stood quietly at the edge of the village, its wooden beams weathered by time but sturdy. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and oil, mingling with the faintest trace of something less tangible: tension, unease. Inspector Craddock was already there, examining the loose floorboard where the letters had been found. Miss Marple joined him, kneeling to inspect the area herself. It was well concealed, she mused. Not a place one would stumble upon by accident? Someone went to considerable trouble, the inspector agreed. But to what end? Were they trying to hide evidence or simply torment Forsyth with reminders? Her eyes caught a faint smudge near the edge of the board, something almost imperceptible. "Look here," she said, pointing. "This smudge appears to be a partial fingerprint, though it's too faint for us to identify without further analysis." Craddock nodded. "I'll have the lab run it immediately. Perhaps it will lead us somewhere." They spent the next hour searching the mill, uncovering little else of significance, though the sense of a watchful presence lingered in the silence. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the back door, a heavy, iron-latched entrance, slightly ajar. "Curious," she remarked. "Why would this door be left open, especially in a place like this?" The inspector frowned. "Could have been someone slipping away unnoticed." Miss Marple felt a sudden urge to explore the area beyond the door. Stepping outside, she noticed a faint path leading into the overgrown thicket nearby. It was narrow, scarcely more than a trodden line through the underbrush. "Shall we see where this leads?" she asked. Together, they followed the path for a few hundred yards until it opened into a small clearing. At the center lay a discarded parcel, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Carefully, Craddock picked it up and untied the string, revealing its contents. A worn leather-bound notebook, its cover creased and edges frayed. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. This may well be the ledger mentioned earlier, a record of accounts, donations, and expenditures for the village's charity funds. She flipped through the pages, noting the careful script, the meticulous entries, and then, more troubling, the sections marked in red ink: corrections, crossouts, and suspiciously large sums withdrawn without clear explanation. "This confirms much," she said softly. "There has been tampering with the accounts, and if Forsyth was on the trail of this, it would explain his growing distress." As they returned to the village, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled around the implications. The ledger was a tangible link to the hidden motives behind the murder, and yet it did not point directly to a culprit. Many had access to these records. Many had reason to alter them. Later that evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire with the ledger open on her lap. She thought of Harold Griggs, the uneasy treasurer, of Adrian Smythe, whose charm masked something darker, of Mrs. Bellamy, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, and of Violet, the maid, who had uncovered the letters. Each had a secret, a motive, and a stake in the unfolding drama. Her quiet contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Violet, her face pale but determined. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "there's something I must tell you. Something I didn't notice before." Inviting her inside, Miss Marple listened intently as Violet described a late-night encounter she had witnessed near the mill. Two figures meeting under the cover of darkness, speaking in hushed tones before parting in haste. "Did you recognize them?" Miss Marple asked. Violet hesitated. One was Adrian Smythe, the other, I'm not sure, but the way they spoke, it was clear they were planning something. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The pieces were moving, the shadows lengthening. There was still much to uncover, but the truth was drawing nearer, as inevitable as dawn. With a steady hand and a keen mind, Miss Marple prepared for the delicate unraveling of a web woven with greed, fear, and betrayal, ready to bring the hidden into the light. Miss Marple thanked Violet with a gentle nod and a promise of discretion, watching the young woman retreat down the garden path, her footsteps light but hurried as if eager to distance herself from the gravity of her confession. The little maid's words lingered in Miss Marple's mind, a fragile thread tying Adrian Smythe to the murky dealings surrounding the mill and the ledger. It was a connection that demanded careful exploration, for in this quiet village, appearances had often proved deceptive. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of day that encouraged introspection rather than haste. Yet Miss Marple was anything but idle. She summoned Inspector Craddock to her cottage, sharing Violet's revelation and the urgent need to observe Adrian Smythe closely. The inspector, ever pragmatic, agreed to increase surveillance discreetly, ensuring that Smythe's movements would be noted without alarming him. Meanwhile, Miss Marple set out to visit Harold Griggs, the treasurer. His nervous demeanor and evasive answers had long drawn her attention, and now, armed with the knowledge of the forged ledger entries, she was determined to unravel his role in the tangled web. Griggs's modest home, a tidy cottage with neat, flower beds, seemed an unlikely venue for subterfuge, but as Miss Marple was well aware, deception often wore the guise of normality. She found him in the sitting room, wringing his hands and avoiding her gaze. "Mr. Griggs," she began softly, "I have been thinking about the ledger. It's clear that someone has manipulated the accounts." Griggs swallowed hard. I'm afraid I don't understand, Miss Marple." "Perhaps not. But you must have noticed irregularities, withdrawals that did not match the official records?" He nodded, finally meeting her eyes. "Yes, I found some discrepancies last month. I wanted to report them, but I was afraid. There are powerful people in this village, and I feared the consequences." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened with quiet understanding. Fear can make even the most honest man hesitate, but hiding the truth only allows the problem to grow. Griggs sighed, a burden seeming to lift from his shoulders. "There's more, Miss Marple. The money wasn't just missing. It was being used to silence people. I overheard a conversation between Smythe and Forsyth. They argued fiercely about the funds. Smythe was threatening to expose Forsyth's past if he didn't stop poking around." A flicker of surprise crossed Miss Marple's face. Smythe's polished exterior masked a sharper, more ruthless ambition than many suspected. "Did Forsyth say anything about this?" she asked. "No." He was worried. Said he was close to finding proof of Smythe's wrongdoing, but he needed more. As Miss Marple absorbed this, a sudden knock at the door startled them both. It was Mrs. Bellamy, the village's social doyenne, her expression unusually grave. "Miss Marple," she said, "I'm afraid I must speak with you. Something has come to light, something I cannot ignore." Inviting her in, Miss Marple listened, as Mrs. Bellamy described a letter she had received the previous evening, anonymous and threatening. It warned of further exposure if certain matters were not quietly resolved. The handwriting was unfamiliar, Mrs. Bellamy said, folding the letter carefully. "But the message is clear. Whoever wrote this wants to frighten someone. Perhaps Smythe, perhaps others." Miss Marple felt the familiar stirrings of a puzzle growing more intricate. The threats, the blackmail, the stolen money, all threads weaving into a dangerous pattern. Later that day, While the rain pattered softly against the windows, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock convened once more at the mill. This time, they brought along Violet, hoping her sharp eyes might spot something they had overlooked. Violet's gaze drifted to the broken teacup shards arranged on a small cloth nearby, the remnant of that fateful afternoon's gathering. She picked up one fragment, tracing its jagged edge with a finger. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "did anyone ever find out how the teacup got broken? It seemed an accident then. But now—" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The shattered teacup was indeed the first sign of something amiss, an interruption in the village's calm. It was not just a careless accident, but a symbol, perhaps, of a deeper fracture. As they spoke, Inspector Craddock's radio crackled with news from the station, an urgent report that Smythe had been seen leaving the village in a hurry, his car speeding down the lane toward the main road. Without hesitation, the trio set off to follow, their pace quickening with every step. They caught sight of Smythe's vehicle halted at the crossroads, the driver's door swinging open as he confronted a familiar figure, Jonathan Cleary, the solicitor from London. The two men spoke in low but tense tones, their eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and desperation. Miss Marple observed quietly from behind a hedge, piecing together the scene. Smythe's face was pale but determined. Cleary's expression was equally grave. After a moment, Smythe turned sharply and walked away, disappearing down a side path toward the village. Cleary remained behind, pulling a folded document from his briefcase and examining it intently. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Cleary, might I ask what brings you here in such haste?" Cleary looked up, startled but recognizing her immediately. "Miss Marple, I had hoped to avoid further trouble, but it seems the village's secrets are too stubborn to stay buried." He handed her the document, a set of papers detailing financial transactions connected to Smythe and the village charity. These records confirm the embezzlement, but they also reveal payments made to someone under the name H. Forsyth. Cleary explained. Money was being moved through complex channels, perhaps to buy silence or cooperation. Miss Marple's eyes widened. The puzzle was growing more tangled, the motives deeper. "Thank you, Mr. Cleary. Your arrival at this moment could not be more timely." As Cleary nodded, Miss Marple's mind raced through the implications. Smythe was desperate, the stakes higher than anyone had imagined. Returning to the village, she knew the time had come to confront the suspects, to test their stories and reveal the truths they hoped to conceal. In the quiet of her cottage, she prepared for the delicate dance ahead, where every word, every glance, every hesitation might unlock the final secret behind the puzzle of the shattered teacup. And as the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of the hunt, the steady unraveling of a mystery bound by human frailty, sharp wit, and the unyielding quest for justice. Miss Marple awoke early, the thin morning light filtering softly through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns upon the worn wooden floor. The events of the previous day settled in her mind like a slowly tightening coil. Smythe's sudden flight, Cleary's revealing documents, Violet's confession, all pieces of a complex mosaic that was beginning to take shape. Yet, the heart of the puzzle remained obscured behind layers of fear and deceit. Today, she resolved, would be the day to draw out the final truths. She dressed with quiet deliberation, choosing her attire not for appearance, but for the comfort necessary in what promised to be a day of careful observation and subtle questioning. After a light breakfast, she wrote a brief note to Inspector Craddock, requesting his presence at the village hall in the afternoon. Then she stepped out into the crisp air, making her way toward the familiar gathering place of the village. The hall was already alive with murmurs and shifting glances when she arrived. The villagers had come together at the behest of Craddock, who, under Miss Marple's gentle urging, had agreed to a meeting to address the unsettled mood and the rising tension. The room buzzed with a mixture of curiosity and unease, faces turning toward each other with tentative suspicion. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the crowd, each person a potential key to the mystery. There was Harold Griggs, his shoulders slightly stooped but his eyes alert. Violet standing near the back with a determined set to her jaw. Jonathan Cleary, who had arrived from London the previous evening and now stood near the front, his demeanor calm but watchful. And of course the ever-watchful Mrs. Bellamy, who had taken a seat near the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. As the murmuring died down, Inspector Craddock stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. I understand. These are difficult times, and many questions remain unanswered. Miss Marple has kindly agreed to assist us, and together, we hope to shed light on the troubling events that have disturbed our village." Miss Marple rose gracefully, her presence commanding yet unassuming. "Friends," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "we find ourselves caught in a tangle of worries and fears, but it is often in quiet moments, in the smallest details, that the truth reveals itself." Her gaze rested briefly on Smythe's empty chair. Adrian Smythe's absence is a cause for concern, but it also provides us an opportunity to reflect on what has transpired. It is not enough to seek a culprit. We must understand the why and how. There was a respectful silence, broken only by the distant ticking of the old clock on the wall. "Mr. Cleary has shared with me documents," Miss Marple continued, "showing transactions linked to Smythe and payments to H. Forsyth. We know Mr. Forsyth had reason to investigate Smythe, but who else stands to gain or lose from these revelations?" A tentative hand rose, Mrs. Bellamy's. "Miss Marple, I believe many here harbor secrets, perhaps long buried. The charity's funds were a thread woven into the fabric of our lives. If cut, it could unravel more than just ledgers." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. And fear of exposure can drive a person to desperate acts." She then turned her attention to Harold Griggs. "Mr. Griggs, you mentioned overhearing a confrontation between Smythe and Mr. Forsyth?" Griggs swallowed nervously. "Yes, Miss Marple. Smythe was furious, threatening Forsyth, warning him to stop digging or face consequences. It seemed a clash of wills over more than just money." "Did Mr. Forsyth confide in you about his findings?" Miss Marple asked. "Only that he believed Smythe was behind the missing funds and was close to proving it," Griggs replied. Miss Marple considered this carefully. "We must find where Forsyth kept his notes or any evidence he collected. It could be the key to understanding the full extent of Smythe's plans." Violet, emboldened by the calm authority in Miss Marple's voice, stepped forward. "I think I can help. I was in the mill on the day Forsyth disappeared. I saw Smythe there, and later, I found a hidden drawer in the old desk. It had papers inside, notes and calculations." The room fell into a hush as Violet's words sank in. "Would you be willing to show us this drawer and its contents?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes, Miss Marple," Violet replied, "though I'm afraid I didn't take anything with me. I thought it best to tell you now." The inspector nodded. "We'll accompany you. It's imperative we examine all possible evidence." They set off together, the group moving with a purposeful silence toward the mill. The building stood as a stoic witness to the village's turmoil, its windows reflecting the dull sky and the unease within. Inside, Violet led them to the desk she had described. After some searching, she pressed a hidden latch beneath the surface, and a small drawer slid open, revealing a bundle of papers yellowed with age, but still legible. Miss Marple took the papers with care, her eyes scanning the meticulous handwriting. Among the notes were lists of expenditures, names crossed out and rewritten, and a series of letters arranged like a coded message. She frowned thoughtfully. "Here is evidence of deliberate manipulation, payments made to obscure accounts, attempts to cover tracks." Inspector Craddock inspected the documents closely. "This confirms what we suspected. Smythe was embezzling funds, using the charity as a front. But, Miss Marple said, there is something more here. This note, dated just days before Forsyth's disappearance, references a meeting with someone named C. It seems Forsyth was on the verge of uncovering a partner in crime. The mention of C cast a new shadow. Who could this mysterious figure be? Smythe's desperation made sense if he were protecting an accomplice. Back in the village, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Miss Marple's subtle inquiries began to unravel old alliances and hidden grudges. Mrs. Bellamy's whispered. Warnings about long-held secrets proved prescient, as villagers who once smiled cordially now exchanged wary glances. As dusk fell, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, clutching the papers. She poured herself a cup of tea, the shattered fragments of the original teacup lingering in her thoughts like a metaphor for the fractured piece of St. Mary Mead. The answers were near, but one last test remained, the subtle psychological game she had employed before, to watch the flicker of guilt in a suspect's eyes, to hear the tremor of truth beneath carefully chosen words. Tomorrow, she would gather the key figures once more, to watch, to listen, and to reveal. For the puzzle of the shattered teacup was not simply about a broken vessel, but about the breaking of trust, the cracking of facades, and the ultimate restoration of justice in a village forever changed by secrets and lies.